The Holy Gospel this morning comes from St. Luke in the 6th chapter. So Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of the many diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And in all, the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. And then he looked up at the disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. And blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because surely your reward is great in heaven, because that is what our ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. And woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. And woe to you when all speak well of you, because that is what our ancestors did to the false prophets." The gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. There's so many stories I want to share today, but in the interest of keeping the one that Chris is recording in under an hour, I'll just share a couple. But one of the things to remember about this particular story, this is the Beatitudes, but it's the Luke version of the Beatitudes, okay? So when the Beatitudes are told in Matthew, Jesus is on a mountain. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus goes and delivers this huge sermon from the mountaintop. But you'll notice in the Gospel of Luke that that's not what happens here. In the Gospel of Luke, there's something a little different. When Jesus delivers these Beatitudes, he comes down from the mountain and enters into a level plain. That is, that Jesus is not up on a mountain delivering the Beatitudes as he is in Matthew, but rather in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus comes down and gets on the same level with all the people to whom he's going to be speaking. The disciples, those who are seeking cures, knowledge, whatever the case may be. And it's important to remember, because what Luke wants us to see is that Jesus comes into our world, enters into our world. The incarnation is God coming into our lives, into the very stuff and fabric of the way we live. And so what happens is that Jesus comes down from the mountain to be with us, to deliver these blessings and woes here in the Gospel of Luke. And this is important to remember because Jesus comes from the future. Because one of the benefits, of course, of being up on the mountain is that you get a bigger view. You get a broader understanding of where the boundaries are, where things go, how rivers turn, what might be out there. But when you're all on a level plane, even the tallest of people can only see so far, and those who are short, well, all you're going to ever see is knees. So, when you look on the level plane, everybody kind of has to stay within their own little purview. And of course, what happens in our lives is that we kind of build ourselves that way. We know we can't know the future. We forget about the past. And so we just kind of build these little bubbles for our lives that kind of extend out a few feet. And that's pretty much all we know or see. And we live our lives quite comfortably, for most of us at least, within those little bubbles. But when Jesus comes down, he's seen everything. He's seen the boundaries. He's seen the scope of what God is able to accomplish. He knows where things are going to go and what is going to happen, who are on the margins and who are in the center. So when Jesus enters in, he literally brings the power of change with him. He brings the power of change because he has seen what it looks like with a broader vision. He's had the view from 35,000 feet to be able to look down and see the cosmos as it is meant to be. Whereas we're trapped with our own views, our own small ways of looking at things. And so what happens, of course, is because we have these rather small and limited views, and things don't change very often within it, most of us just assume things will never change. Things will be the same old, and whatever happened yesterday will probably happen tomorrow, and so on and so forth. And we despair of change actually ever happening or actually coming into our lives and making a difference. Or if it does, it might just kind of move the bubble just a little bit. We might expand it with a new grandchild or a new son-in-law or whatever the case might be. But by and large, things don't change. But when Jesus enters the level plane, things have the potential to change. And that's why he's talking about these blessings and woes. What Jesus is saying is to those who are right now feeling filled with despair and hopelessness, he's saying that there is blessing. There is blessing for you. And I know people are going to revile you when you say that you have a better life and a better future. But they reviled people who did that back in the day. Our ancestors did that. Jesus says there is change. There is hope coming. And to those who are better off, Jesus has the kind reminder to remember that things will change. And it might not always be as fun and rosy as it is right now. So these blessings and woes are a sign for Jesus that he's seen what our potential is. He's seen where we go and what our boundaries are. And within them, he understands that change is possible. And so he enters into our lives, enters into the level plane so that the change can happen. People can be healed of diseases. People can be cured of demons or whatever Jesus brings for their salvation. Now, so for most of us, change kind of comes along and we take it as we go. And I've been trying to figure out a way in which to tell this story, and it's just gonna happen. So the blue hymnal that we've been singing out of this with one voice. My first interim that I ever did back in the early 90s was at the University Lutheran Church of Hope in Minneapolis, Minnesota, right in the center of the campus at the University of Minnesota. And this particular church had a long tradition of putting out bishops and professors and preachers throughout its history. It was a huge Norwegian congregation that had been started in about the time that our church here was started in the late 1880s. And so this church had been around for a long time and had been really integral to the Minneapolis, to the state of Minnesota, in moving things along over the course of the early part of the 20th century. And so at this particular time, they had a pastor, and he was a very gifted preacher. And one day, the people in St. Paul, now there's so many Lutherans up in Minnesota that both Minneapolis and St. Paul have their own synods, okay? So that just gives you an idea just how many Lutherans there are. And even though they're separated by a river, sometimes only as wide as that aisle that separates our congregation, there are two separate synods, and Pastor Mark was a great pastor over in Minneapolis, and the people in St. Paul thought he was good enough to be their bishop, so they elected him bishop. And so he went to church the next Sunday and said, "Sorry, I won't be able to be with you anymore. I just got elected bishop across the river." So there we go. They needed to find an interim, and they couldn't find anybody, so they wound up with me. And so I'm sitting there in this congregation, and they had a huge tradition of worship and liturgy. So, you know, the chancel at University Lutheran Church of Hope is about twice the size of this one, all right? And the organ sits way on the back wall and covers the whole back wall. And then they have the choir sitting in front of it, and the choir was about 100 people. And then they paid professional musicians to play the music, you know, flutes, cellos, all that kind of stuff. I mean, this congregation was huge in that sense, and the worship was very, very traditional and very much. And so I was sitting in my office, and then I just, and I had to share the office because the pastor got elected to be bishop, and he was still working. He didn't have an office yet in St. Paul, so he and I kind of shared an office for a while. So I had it in the afternoons, he had it in the mornings. I taught in the mornings, and then so it kind of worked out. And so I'm sitting there one afternoon, and I get a phone call. All right, now this is before cell phones, so in the old days, you guys all remember phones that you actually had to pick up that had a line. And it's a friend of mine. His name is Craig. We'd gone to college together, and we had actually gone to seminary as well together, and so we had known each other. He was always a few years older than me. But Craig called me, and he said, "Scott," he said, you're Hope." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, I wonder if you can do me a favor." And I said, "Well, I don't know." He said, my partner Frank has designed this new liturgy that he wants the Lutheran Church to use. And I was like, "Craig, we're Lutheran. We don't need new liturgy." I said, "The green hymnal's doing us just fine. We've had it since 1978. It was now 1993. So, you know, it's been 25 years. We're doing quite well with the green hymnal. Do any of you remember the green hymnal? A few of you do. We have a couple of copies out there next to the With One Voice if you want." So anyhow, I said, "Sure." He said, Frank works over here at Augsburg Fortress with us, and he said he wants to come over and just show you this liturgy and just see if it's something. He's working on it. And I said, okay, come on, he can come over. So he came over, and we walked in, and we had a grand piano up here like this, and so Frank went over to the piano, he started playing this liturgy, and he said, what do you think? And I said, well, yeah, fine, liturgy, you know. He said, I was wondering if we could use your church for 6 months and work on this liturgy, you know, work on the music. He said, I'm writing the music as we're going, and if we could do all that kind of stuff, I was wondering if your congregation would be willing to do that. And I was like, well, if you're ever going to do something like that, you do it when the interim's there. So I said, let me ask. So we went and we talked to the council, and they were like, oh, sure, we're an interim. Why not? Let's learn a new liturgy. And so we did. And so Frank came, and it just so happened that our music director at that time said, you know, this would be a perfect sabbatical for me to go learn how to play the organ. And I was like, sure. So he says, I'm going to go to Germany for 6 months and learn how to play the organ. I was like, okay. So he took off, and so then without a music director, we brought Frank in to lead our choirs and our musicians and to teach us this new liturgy that he was writing. And so what would happen on Sunday mornings, we'd do a liturgy, we'd literally learn it. He'd come a few minutes, people would come a few minutes early before service. He'd stand in front, he'd teach them a few lines of the liturgy. Then later on in the service, you know, whether it was the Alleluia or whether it was the Kyrie or the Hymn of Praise or the Song of Thanksgiving or whatever it was, and then we'd do it during the liturgy, and then each week we'd kind of add to it. And this went on for the course of about 6 months. And at the end, when it was all said and done, what you had was what we just started, which is setting 5 of With One Voice. All right? So that Kyrie eleison, I've been singing for over almost 30 years. I learned that in 1993, when it was still just paper that Frank was writing and giving to me 5 minutes before the service. We are talking about change. And what happened is that as we began to work our way through that liturgy, it was different. And you know that Kyrie eleison part that we do, I mean, that has rhythm. And if you remember the green hymnal, we were so far away from rhythm, it wasn't even funny. And so what happened is that we had to learn, we had to switch, we had to think about all of a sudden music having a different reason for being in the worship. And our musicians, all trained, wonderfully gifted musicians, had to learn how to play in a different way or sing in a different way in order to accommodate what was going on in this blue hymnal. And so as many things went, the blue hymnal was being processed at that time, and oftentimes we'd get a version of a hymn. And this is what I really wanted to talk about, because in the green hymnal, although there were many great hymns in the green hymnal, there was one hymn that was not in the green hymnal. And it was a hymn that was very dear to me. Now, many of you know that I grew up in the Swedish Lutheran Church. And in the particular church that I did, we did just normal things. We were very high liturgy and things like that and whatnot. But nonetheless, in this particular church where I had gone, we sang hymns. Oftentimes we sang the first verse in Swedish even. This was kind of the stuff we did. And so for me, worship had always been something that was very, very traditional and very much formed and very much ritualized. And there were certain ways that you behaved and you reverenced the altar. And if you've watched me, I still have those things. I bow before I come to the altar. I make the sign of the cross 7 times in a service, if you want to know how many. I mean, these are just things that I grew up with learning, part of my piece. So Frank came to me and said, we want to put this hymn into the hymnal. Do you think it'll work? And I looked at it, and tears came to my eye. It goes like this: day by day, your mercies, Lord, attend me, bringing comfort to my anxious soul. Day by day, the blessings, Lord, you send me, draw me near to my heavenly goal. Love divine beyond all mortal measure brings to naught the burden of my quest. Savior, lead me to the home I treasure, where at last I'll find eternal rest. And I told Frank, I said, any hymnal that has that hymn in it, I'm on board with. It's number 746, and Karen, I think we're singing it during communion, right? Yeah. I mean, things change, but they change because they make sense. When Jesus enters into the level plane, he wants to be able to communicate with us. He wants us to be able to see that things can change for the better. And for those who are filled with despair and hopelessness, that change for the better is only going to bring joy and happiness. And to those who are now in the throes of some kind of good luck or good fortune, whatever it might be, to know that there could be woe upon us because it might not last. But nonetheless, the purpose of what Jesus is doing in entering our lives is to give us a sense that change is going to come, that things do change and we don't have to feel despair when they do. Sometimes the change is going to bring us hope and life and peace. It's going to remind us of a part of our tradition and our history. As our world continues to open up, as our world becomes more colorful, as people of different races, of people of different skin colors begin to blend, as we find ways in which we can move together as a people, not only here at Blair, but throughout the ELCA, throughout the church itself, and throughout the world, to find ways that we can live together in hope and harmony rather than with war and destruction is what we are asked to do. And in order to make that happen, God enters into our level plane. God does not just throw us out there and hope for the best, but rather enters into our lives, bringing salvation, bringing hope, bringing healing, curing demons, feeding those who have no food. And we live on that change that is able to take us and transform us from people who are encapsulated in our own little privatized bubbles into people who are broken free to be able to live with each other and with God and even with ourselves as a way to begin to see what God sees. A world filled with hope and peace, promise and love. Amen.